restaurant in the Beaubourg. But there are a whole lot of other projects which we're now going to hear about, which move, I believe, just prior to that and coming up to the present day. And so these are projects which range from, I believe, housing projects through to some quite large theatre work and some developments which I'm looking forward to hearing about. I shan't keep you any longer. Of course, Brendan is a principal of the practice, and we look forward to hearing about the work of Brendan and his partner, who's unfortunately not going to be here today. So, but it's Jakob MacFarlane, as you all know, and I have a list of things here which I shan't say because it's much better if you hear it from the man himself, and we all look forward to hearing about it. And thank you very much, Brendan.
Thanks. And then I just go down now from here.
Yeah, we just click.
Oh, this one a minute. Okay, great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for first of all for inviting our office to speak at the AA. I think we're pretty touched by that because it's a school that I've had a little bit to do with, just essentially being on juries over the years, but never having actually shown our work. So I think we're quite, first of all, I think we'd like to thank the AA a lot. Thank you, John, for the introduction. And it's something, essentially London is something which is part of my culture. I'm born in New Zealand, and essentially I'm New Zealand English, so it's sort of cross-cultural in a sense. I live in France. I have been working in France with my partner Dominique Jakob, who is French, for about 12 years now. And we have essentially a kind of a very mixed office of different nationalities. And I think that's kind of something I'm very proud of. I've been teaching for 2 years in the Bartlett program, in the diploma program, and I had my own course there for 2 years. And essentially having gone through that, at one point decided, and it was very much around the time of winning the competition for Pompidou, that it was absolutely impossible, I thought, to work and teach at the same time. I think it's something which is one of these strange subjects, working in teaching, because I think one motivates the other. And if anything, I think I came to one of the last juries here in the AA more recently, and I appreciated very much sitting on that. But it's something which actually the more work you do, the less, in a sense, you get involved in the teaching part of it. So it's something which is a kind of a strange balance, and I'm sure you'll find that as you leave the school and go out and form your own practices, and then wonder how you're going to kind of balance those things out. But I think the ideas are critical, and it's something which hopefully you can keep up the teaching or keep up the being involved in schools. I think is an essential part. I mean, it's a minor point, and it's not the point of this evening's lecture, of course, but it just made me think of that when I was coming in the door. Maybe we could turn the light down a little bit, and maybe a little bit more. I don't know if you're used to having your lectures with a lot of light. Anyway, the first project that I have about 7 projects that we're showing tonight. We being my partner and I, of course Dominic's not here. And I'll jump backwards and forwards between I and we, of course, being a practice. But we have 7 projects, all under the title of Transcapes. And essentially they're 7 projects which we showed in an exhibition which is just finished at the FRAC in Orléans, in an art gallery in Orléans, architecture art, which essentially, of course, I think you would know is responsible for an organization which is responsible for creating Archilab. And every year in France they show 2 architects' works from around the world, and this year was the first exhibition we had. So it's actually, in a way, traveling on from that exhibition, which closed about a little bit less than a month ago, that tonight I'm showing 7 projects, which essentially were in a way the framework for that exhibition. The 7 projects actually travel across time. They jump around a little bit. They're not linear. The reason why I began in a sense with, or would like to begin with George, is to somehow also evacuate it, because it's 5 years ago somehow, but at the same time evacuate and not. There's ideas, there's things that we keep on sort of ruminating through the projects, and I think that's why it's also important to show it. 5 years ago, in a way, or a little bit more maybe now, 6 years ago, we won a competition for Centre Pompidou for the restaurant, which is now known as Georges. And it's a restaurant which is, I don't know if I have a pointer too, but maybe if there's one here, that would be great. Otherwise, not to worry if you don't have one. To the right, anyway, of the plan, we see an intervention with sort of 4 kind of fluid-like objects. And those objects essentially make up the primary part of the project. They're 4 volumes, and they're 4 programmatic pieces, which, fantastic, thanks a lot. Okay, great. They're 4 pieces here, essentially, which make up the program of a restaurant. Our intention with Pompidou was very simple. We were given a program, a very simple program, sort of about 5 lines long. It was at the level of almost simplistic. Pompidou launched a competition. They said, "Can you create a restaurant, in a sense, for the new century?" Which was quite an ambitious idea. The idea that it was going to open in the new millennium. And the idea that the restaurant was also going to be somehow seen to be as one of the elements, in a way, pushing Pompidou as a cultural centre into a new millennium and a kind of renaissance of the centre. This centre up until then had been kind of like a lot of institutions of this type around the world, had gone through, I think, sort of quite major changes in asking themselves about what they could possibly do now that the financial system at that point in France had deteriorated so much that public funding for the institution had gone way down, and the big push was to actually get private investors, private donors, private patrons for exhibitions, but also involved in funding the different projects within the centre. So we launched with them. We won a competition for a new restaurant, and also, in a sense, a place that would be open beyond the opening hours of the centre itself. And that meant, in a sense, that we had to create something that was not just a restaurant, but also, in a sense, something which would, in a way, create a new identity somehow to this part of the centre, and also somehow possibly be in dialogue with that. So if I move on, essentially the space that we're talking about is this terrace area and also the big rectangle to the side. These are very early sketches, ideas about, we had, in a sense, one of the big problems with Pompidou was that the floor for the space really was the only thing that we could work with. We couldn't work with the walls, we couldn't work with the ceiling. And so we decided, in a way, to break the program down into these 4 elements and then actually start to kind of work with the floor and introduce the elements, in a way, by slipping the elements under what we called really a conceptual carpet, which was the floor, and deforming the carpet upwards. These, of course, are part of the kind of, it's a very sort of simplistic sense of the kind of the structure of the space that exists. But this grid that's stretched up onto this carpet, and by this kind of deformation, is a grid which is related to the Centre Pompidou, in the way that right across the whole surface of the plan of Centre Pompidou, we have increments coming down from 80 or going up from 80, 160, 320, 640, etc., 1280. And these become both the increments, which are, in a way, the infill right through to the structure. And they become, in a sense, the determining elements. So from that kind of grid, we decided to use both the grid and the floor as our surface to work with, or our thing to work with, because of these constraints that I'm talking about. And also, and I think because we wanted to actually, the intention was to take somehow something which was neutral in its vocabulary, avoid the vocabulary of Centre Pompidou, which is so extraordinary and so specific that we all know about the tubes which are color-coded in terms of a kind of 60s approach to sort of a structuralist approach to the outside and the inside of the building. Our thing was to try and avoid that to any cost, but take something which was highly neutral. In this case, it was the grid and the floor. But at the same time, by deforming the floor and by moving upwards with the different programs, essentially what we could then create was something new but working somehow with the building. And that was very much out of an intention to make an intervention in the space and at the same time forge a new identity. So somehow forge a dialogue with the space and also a new identity. And that seemed very important, both actually dealing with somehow the history and what in a way was implied architecturally with Pompidou, but actually was in some ways never fulfilled, and then ultimately moving on from that and creating a kind of a new, not new direction, but forging ahead in a sense, and trying to create something from that. All of that said, this is the ducting on the outside of the Pompidou. This is the ducting on the lower level under the roof of Pompidou. These are air ducts, the big ones, and then you have electricity and water. So if we keep on moving, these are in a sense just conceptual developments of the piece as we move through. And then actually finally coming to a plan, so we sort of jump from the conceptual stuff, and I'm going to make a couple of sort of fast jumps because otherwise it would be prolonging the issue. The entry is here and the entry is here. You come outside across the terrace at night or you come through here, depending on what program is being run inside Pompidou. Pompidou is a very interesting situation. It's not just a restaurant, but for them it's actually a place where they can have a meeting room, a private meeting room for Pompidou, so we can close up this volume. And it's red because it was, in a way, a kind of we tipped our hat towards a space, a building actually, that Pompidou lived in for a couple of years while the centre was the administration worked in for a couple of years while the whole building was being redone from 98 to 2000. And we took the red, which was done by a fellow architect, as being a kind of an identifying thing, and as a kind of memory for that period when the administration would come back into this building, and also a clin d'oeil for notating their space, because in a sense, otherwise the doors open and the space becomes used by the rest of the restaurant. So there's a kind of double programmation, which is quite important. Then the second actual space, which is important as a double programmation space, is the bar space. And inside that bar, we have a video presentation of artists that are presenting their work concurrently or coming up within Centre Pompidou. So Centre Pompidou is doing the programmation for the video within the bar. And that's interesting. You've got this kind of double overlap going on. Okay. Otherwise, these are just very simple images of the conceptual phase and the modelling and the images of that. And then, in a sense, the relation of that, then we go to the question of how were we going to build it. I think all of these things parallel each other because we had huge problems as to building in the Centre Pompidou. We had very big restrictions on the weight. So essentially, at the same time, we had a big interest to both kind of create a camouflage with the surface and also kind of reflect back the light into the space. We had a lot of problems with lighting levels being very bright near the windows, but actually being very low the further you go into the space. So what we wanted to was also balance the light out to both sides of the face as you're sitting inside the space and eating, for example. Which becomes an important part of the program. Here, it's essentially for us, it's a skinned project. So the structure in this sense becomes a kind of secondary element, but important to show, and obviously we had to model all of these things, developing a way also to bring the floor up onto the volume with quite a lot of precision. Each volume also sits on kind of hydraulic pumping springs, because the building of Pompidou moves backwards and forwards something like 17 centimetres from one side of the other, on one side, the short sides, from one side to the other. So we actually had to make these volumes independent from the floor itself. as well as we had movement joints which were coming through the volume. So essentially it led to the idea of putting them up onto springs. So essentially under each volume it's essentially like a car with a lot of different springs around all the edges. These are studies. This is what I was talking about. Every one of these is a spring box. So the whole volume sits down. Extremely light volume. The structure is a 1 centimeter thick plate aluminium, and the skin is in 4 millimeter thick aluminium. And essentially what we did then was we found... I should tell you that Pompidou initiated the competition but did not have 1 centime or 1 penny, right, to pay for the project. So what we then had to do was create another competition with Pompidou to find an exploitant, someone that would both run the cafe, the restaurant, but also pay for all the work. And we found a group called the Costs, which have become quite famous in France, being quite supportive behind quite important pieces of design over about 20, 25 years. And this family actually ended up being the ones that decided to build the project in its entirety. So it was a wonderful history of having a great patron, a great client in that sense, and something that surprised us all the way. Anyway, the point of all of that was to say then going into fabrication was we had to find a company that would build these, and essentially we found boat builders in the south of France, which essentially are making yachts, a number of America's Cup yachts to their credit, but having never built anything to do with the architecture world. So it was a great moment because this stuff's becoming less and less unusual. I think now we're working more and more with industries which are to do with the aviation, boats, sport. I think more and more architects are kind of diversifying. But certainly for us in 99 or 98, that was an interesting thing to do, certainly. I think it's still quite unusual. Because luckily we also had a reasonable budget for this project, and we were able to accomplish things which are probably a little bit harder normally to accomplish. Anyway, these are just diagrams showing the structural and skin studies. So we had a huge job of sending our numeric dossiers down to the boat builders. They in turn then took the dossier from our software and then translated it into a software which they were using, 2 different softwares which they essentially were using only in the boat building industry, and then actually having to then send it back to us and us having to do the transformation. So it was it was a phenomenally laborious project, but under this kind of paranoia of time, working for the new millennium, which was good because it pushed the project. These are studies by the engineers. We had a lot of lateral and vertical load studies of the piece. We worked with the engineers of RFR. Just to describe a little bit, this is taking, for example, I just wanted to show you one of the volumes. Essentially, these are the video which are on the circuit of art video system for Pompidou. These come down into the bar. Everything, in a sense, that comes down into the bar is somehow appropriated from the existing system, whether it's air or whether it's electricity or whether it's water. And what was important for us was not actually to touch the appropriation, but was to somehow direct it down into the volumes where we need it but nothing more. So there's also I think an important word which would be appropriation or redirection of an existing system. Okay, so that's seeing these are studies, of course, loading studies, displacement, deformation studies. Of course, these are pattern drawings. We move on, and then into the fabrication phase, which was an extraordinary experience because these are gigantic pieces that we had to build in their entirety, but actually each piece was already, a little bit like the hand sketch, was already broken down into a chunk. And the chunk actually corresponds with the maximum size of the lift of Pompidou, which is a gigantic lift. But we had to bring every chunk by truck up to Paris and then deliver between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning, and deliver these into the space. So what we did in the south of France was we built all of these volumes as whole things, and then unbolted all of the pieces. So here you've both got the structure and the skin. And what was interesting in this, we worked with a machine which the company bought, thank God, during the phase. This is, you can see the size of the shop. It's gigantic. It's like really an aircraft hangar from much bigger boats. But they bought a machine called an Ecole machine, E-C-K-O-L-D, and it's really like a sunflower, which is an extraordinary machine, which actually comes down on the surface with thousands of points, which either, in a way, they push down and they either stretch or out, or they stretch in, creating either a concave or a convex curve. And it's maybe one of the more sophisticated machines used in the boat building industry, but it certainly helped us working on, very, very severe, complex geometry curves, as you can see here, for example. And then once inside the Centre Pompidou, once having delivered the pieces, and then actually recoupling, rewelding, rejointing everything on site. So we had what was extraordinary was that then we had parallel crews. These guys that were usually building boats actually displaced and lived inside Paris for about 3 months, 4 months maybe, and building these and receiving the stuff by truck from their own company. So that was quite an experience. And here we are with the finished product. Looking across from the terrace at night, we're looking down on one of the in a sense, the pools of water, which were introduced by Renzo Piano during the 98-2000 period. And of course, you can see the history of the kind of these huge, gigantic, externalized plumbing systems, fluid systems of the building, and then actually the interior plumbing. This is a view from the fountain of Niki Zinfandel, Tingali, which you will know, I'm sure, and this is looking at the red volume from below and just the beginning of the orange bar. And then here we are on the terrace. So it's an aluminium 4mm thick skin, so it's extremely thin, but what's fantastic is by bending all of that, you can really accomplish some fantastic structural feats. I mean, these doors, in the end, become actually a lot of the structure, just in the pure bending of the material. And that's something we wanted to reveal also around the edges. There's a whole kind of thing about how we make the cuts. There's two kinds of cuts. Because essentially we wanted the experience to either cut into or chop to create, for example, the windows. But essentially we wanted the experience to be very brutal and an experience where once you were inside the volume, really you felt you were inside a closed volume, and it just then happened to be cut in order to access light or physically enter into it. And this was something about the continuity of the surface, and then obviously having to work with the functional aspect of getting in and getting out of the volumes. Okay, so these are then, of course, views around. So your floor is aluminium, your volumes are aluminium, coming severely down at some places and then deforming up in other places. What's extraordinary is the light inside the space, because, as you all know, Paris is a city of light, and the changing light is kind of fantastic. And really, here on the top floor of Pompidou, we have a movement of light, panoramic movement of light right around the city, which is quite strong and forever changing throughout the day. So inside each volume, we create a second skin, which is a rubber skin. Again, it's 4mm thick. And essentially, we wanted that to be kind of, in a way, like almost like a suit, or like a kind of diving suit. We wanted the inside to be a floor which was, again, deformed up onto the surfaces. Here you see the aluminium left as simply as possible, the 4mm, and then you see the 4mm rubber here. And then there's an aluminium detail, extruded element, which is set back in behind that. But we essentially wanted the two skins to read, one being a very soft and or softish and warm interior space, and the other, of course, offsetting this kind of very supposedly cold, but aluminium actually is not that cold really. This is moving around inside the bathrooms. The windows are important for us because they're moments where we get rid of the first, in a way, the foreground, and we jump the eye into the second and third foreground. It's all about people, for example, in the bathrooms looking at the ceiling, looking at actually how the ceiling is interacting with the bubbles. So we're trying to kind of direct people's attention to certain things. This is the red volume I was talking about, which is the volume which is closed by these big, gigantic sliding doors. Each of these panels is unique, of course, as they're just cut out of the skin, and they close up and essentially form this as a private dining room, either for Pompidou or, as I said, it's open with the space itself. But again, the rubber, again, the air being brought in, nothing fussy about this. The idea was to really keep it as brute or as simple as possible. Okay. Now the next project I wanted to mention was a project which actually followed on from Pompidou, and it is essentially a bookshop in Paris. And the lady who is our client for the bookshop came to us with extremely small budget and but a great passion for selling artists' books. And it's called the Florence Lowy Books by Artists. And essentially there are books either conceptualized and fabricated by someone else or literally fabricated by the artists themselves. I mean, an example would be pieces, for example, like some of the most famous from the 60s and 70s would be icon pieces like Ed Ruscha's Sunset Boulevard, etc., being an example of an artist's book, or there's, as I said, there's books by artists. What's interesting with her is, as I said, she had a very tiny budget, and she had another problem, not just being the budget, but she had a space where she had half of her bookshop had to be in stock and half of it had to be on display, but in the same space, for the public, so that you would actually be in the space, but you would be, you could be or you may not be looking at her stock room. So instead of cutting the space in two in a kind of caricatural way, we decided to keep the space in its entirety and actually make, in a way, part of the stock room, part of the experience of buying a book. And essentially that was our one attitude. The other one was that we took the grid of essentially what her average sized book, which wasn't her average sized book, but her average sized big book, which is about 35 centimeters. We made a block about that and decided actually the block or the format of the book, this middle-sized format, should really become actually an increment that repeated. And so we made from that a matrice or a mesh, and really it becomes essentially what we decided essentially in the end was to create a gigantic matrice which fills the space. And then the only way of getting in and out of the space was to somehow imagine a virtual shopper or someone entering the space virtually and moving through the space and moving through the matrice. And as he moved or she moves through the space, she cuts a movement path. And the movement path is related to a whole series of sort of idiosyncratic things that we imagined, which was picking up a book, deciding not to buy it, moving on to another, deciding that one had to stretch up and reach a high shelf, etc. And this imaginary path we overlaid over the matrice. These are conceptual sketches somehow describing that. And then what we did was, by taking that matrice now, which is really like a 4 meter high volume, 3.5 meter, it's a 45 meters squared floor plate, which is very tiny really. We created this huge volume of books, essentially, and then we essentially this kind of movement path around these volumes created by that then these extrusions, these vertical extrusions from this kind of idiosyncratic movement path. And by doing that, we wanted then to evacuate all of the area which would be a circulation zone, and the zone that would be in a way the leftover, which we called the decored object. So we had a coring and a decoring process, which then produced what we call these kind of book totems. But then the problem was not the totem, but the problem was then also, which in a sense we'd prefigured, of course, was somehow the issue of the books and the stacking of why not put the books on the inside of that totem because it was so large, and why not then keep, of course, the outside for the spectator that walks around. So that's what led to these things, and this is the space, of course. The space is an 18th century building in the 4th arrondissement. We didn't touch it. All we did was really paint the walls and replace the floor, which was... but essentially the intervention, again, is an intervention that takes place in the floor. These are the 2 volumes I talked about, which are empty. And these are virtual outtakes of that. Again, patterns of that. Again, the fabrication of that then in Italia. What for us was kind of extraordinary, and I mentioned that in relationship to Pompidou. Pompidou was a skin project. In this, we, of course, became quite fascinated, and that's why I wanted to show Pompidou. We became extremely fascinated in the structure, but we don't see the structure of Pompidou. And I think this very much led... things are parallel things anyway. The book thing being a problem, but also I think what also helped lead to this was the interest with the Pompidou project, in the sense that now the structure becomes both the volume, the skin is no longer there, the structure is the thing as well as being its own structure. And I think it becomes kind of a very interesting development from the Pompidou project. Somehow one that maybe even interests me more, really. And because of that, actually, what we wanted to was we said, well, why can't we then, because of all of the numeric machinery we're using, Pompidou was certainly using a certain amount of artisanal or hands-on processes to make the exterior skins. In this case, we actually wanted to be absolutely hands-off on this project. And we brought it to such a degree that the wood that we were proposing was already a wood that we chose, which had a very thin melamine laminate on both sides, so we didn't have to varnish it. And then essentially it's a 3D cutting machine which cuts vertically each plate, and then the plates are assembled very much like, in a way, an egg crate. So the hands-on aspect, or the hands-off aspect about this project, I think is a very important aspect for us. Seeing how far we could go in actually creating a numeric project. So these are, of course, fabrication. And this is breaking the thing down. The whole thing breaks down into a series of, in a way, donut elements, which then are joined, which then have a kind of like a tongue groove kind of jointing, or not a tongue groove, I should say, peg jointing inside the thickness of the plywood. So we can see the beginning of the empty volumes up here. These are the volumes finished in the space. This is how we propose to kind of show the books. When we'd finished, or we didn't, it wasn't when we finished, but Florence at one point was extremely nervous because she came to us and said, by the way, how did you think of doing the A to Z? How does that work in your space? And we said, well, it really doesn't. and I think it actually works in an extremely idiosyncratic way. It doesn't have an A to Z, basically. You come in and you just, there's essentially kind of groupings of interest or subjects. And in a way, I like that. I think that's in a way much more intriguing and much more interesting. And certainly, she was the kind of client ready to do that. Anyway, these are the volumes as you move around the space. Again, this is empty in behind this. So it's a void, being the stockroom in behind this one and the one on your left-hand side. And you have like a secret door on the side you wheel away, and then you can go inside that volume. So she can stock all the books as high as she goes. She has a ladder inside that volume. And then all the books are stocked, of course, for the public on the outside. And that's inside one of the volumes looking up vertically. And from the outside, again, it's almost a sort of a London facade to some degree. It's a sort of French Georgian. I don't know if you could really say that, but anyway, it's you got the idea that it's inside. It's an intervention inside an existing shop front. So then the next project I wanted to show you was a theatre in Rouen, in Normandy, which we actually sort of finished more recently, but actually won it a little bit earlier than the date that's shown here. But then, like some of these projects, you know, they're horror stories of planning and timing. In this case, we had a mayor which was replaced by another, which was replaced by another. And we literally, from concept through to finished product, it was like 7 years, which is just extraordinary. And by that time, you're almost forgetting actually what you did to a certain degree. But anyway, thank God we got the thing built, and the concept was very simple, but the project and the space that we were working in was a rather complex one. Certainly, its history was complex. I'm not showing you the building, which is unfortunate because I did have some images of that. But the building that we worked in, we were given an inside of an old theatre, but an old theatre that had been in the 1970s converted to a theatre from a cinema that was converted itself around 1915 from actually a series of row houses. And these row houses essentially formed a gable element like this, and this would be cut into about 4 row houses, 3 or 4 row houses. And what we decided was we were extremely interested in that history. We thought it was quite an important history to somehow, in a way, go back and realize the different aspects to that history. So what we took was, in a way, the domestic volume, because of that was, in a way, the first history. And by taking the next history, but also the last history, which was a theatre. Now, the competition asked us to improve 2 things. One was the acoustic conditions, and the other one was the sight lines. There were 2 major problems, because essentially for a cinema it had worked perfectly well. But for a theatre, of course you know the 2 things are too contrasting. And what we essentially had to do was make a much steeper floor. So we had to start pushing the real floor we had to change, create a new false floor. And the acoustic problems, we had to actually bring down the ceiling and create a series of faceted or chopped, in this case, layers, which would give us, in a sense, the acoustical issues that we wanted, which was rebound when you're on the stage, back in here, fast rebound for the actor, but then, as you all know, other kind of sounds which would come into the auditorium and then rebounce back for the public. And then in the back, of course, there was a problem of absorbing, but that we didn't get involved in. In a sense, we got involved in the acoustic thing as a series of rings, and those rings are defined by a cut, and the cut is made every 2 seats into the auditorium. We drop on what do we call it? A step. We step down. And we're on a platform for a couple of layers of seats, and then we go down to another step. So that stepping sequence became very much, this underface became very much the obvious critical line and the moment in which to cut and slice the histories together. So then we come through, and the piece becomes more and more deformed. We knew also where our levels had to be, and we also knew that we had to get 2 exit and entry openings into the volume from this end. So that's why the thing starts to deform. And then ultimately, well, you saw the last image anyway. Ultimately, we come to this section. This is the existing building. And this is the existing rake that I was telling you about inside the cinema space. And then ultimately we come to our new piece. And really it's like a kind of stomach within an earlier building. And if we keep on going, and you have this kind of slicing thing going on. If you keep on going, that's the piece in section. And then, again, it's an extremely low budget project. We had very, very little money to play with. and really these are wood panels that are painted. They're very, very simple, but they create, I think, and apparently I think everyone is in agreement, so that's good. They create a very rich acoustical quality inside the auditorium. So that's the finished auditorium, and the stage is not us. The stage is the existing stage of the theatre from the 1970s. What's interesting is we have these bridges, and we have a whole series of gantry up and down the theatre that operate behind these layers. And so, in fact, it becomes both a potentially theatrical space to use, of course, but it becomes a very interesting space in order to light this volume, of course, but more importantly, light the stage. And then these are from the 2 entries in the back. And then Maison H is a house which, in fact, is a house that we've never realized. It's a project where quite an extraordinary client came to us, who had been one of these kind of great sort of French success stories with the internet, and had created his own industry in a sense, but he created his own company. Went on the stock market and became extremely rich in a very short period of time. And there was a kind of phenomenon for a number of years in France that you had this kind of about 30 young guys that managed to do this. And one of these people came to us and said he wanted to build a house on a piece of family property, which essentially is here, which is in the southern part of Corsica. Just across the way from Propriano, and it's an extraordinary, as some of you would know that have been to Corsica, it's a phenomenal island. At times you actually wonder whether you're in Tahiti. The beaches are white sand, and of course the vegetation is a very different vegetation, the climate's very different, but with the colour of the ocean and that, it really becomes a kind of very strange, kind of exotic, but European place. Anyway, the point being that he wanted to take his site. Now, the site, I think from memory, is something like 2.5 hectares, but I hope I'm not making an error with that quantity. And essentially what it is there's 2 very small rivers that drop down, very small rivers, very, very small streams that drop down, making the boundary of his site. The entry road is from the top from the side and kind of the top, and then up around this ridge. So this was kind of our side, coming right down to the beach at the bottom, and there was a cliff face here. What was very interesting about him, and this is not the site, this is kind of where actually it's meant to be here. It's not a very good photo to show, but you can see a little bit the situation with the cliff, the kind of bluff, and this big mountain in the background, and the kind of vegetation. What was this is on part of the site looking down, which becomes quite steep towards the right-hand side, and then very steep, there's a kind of bluff here, and then cliffs at the end. What becomes very interesting with him in the site is a number of things. One is that the landscape is a kind of an extraordinary mix of sort of very moody, almost kind of Scottish, I don't know, it's not heather, but very kind of moody, tough landscape, which is called in France, in Corsica, the maquis. And the maquis was a kind of, or is a kind of vegetation, and was, in terms of the history, of course, always the place where people would escape to and live in the maquis for months or years, unnoticed. It was kind of like anyway, certainly kind of like a psycho-historical aspect to the landscape and the people. There's a very strong relationship between the maquis and these two aspects. So what's interesting about our site is we have a kind of a site which is part maquis, part not maquis, but a very rough, crude. This is a view looking up towards a small path as you enter the site. And then looking across, so you have these burnt moments, and then the maquis in the background. You can see how dense the vegetation is. But the vegetation here in the foreground, or the zonation, the kind of, because what's interesting is the vegetation here is not that old. It's maybe like 100 years old. And the landscape before this was actually running with goats. And what you have, if you dig under the grass, you find actually all these animal lines, or these traces of the paths that run with the topography of the site. Also, you find a bunch of old walls which retain the site from slipping down into the ocean. Now, those have all they're just really traces now. But then on top of that, you have some extremely interesting vegetation. As you go in, you zoom into it, you find, this is part of a boot of the landscape, kind of an important moment for us because it was part of really where we started to create the house. As you go into the landscape, you actually find there's some microfauna and micro situations that are very interesting. So we started working we started anyway in a certain amount of detail with a landscapist on just working up and analysing the landscape itself. And then what is really important to say before I jump into this stuff is just to say that he, in his program, was quite interesting because he said, I want to live across the site and I want to live, I don't see the site as a house, although we call it house, but what he saw it as was a collective of pieces. And that he could actually live in different parts of the site during the day. And in summertime, he had this program about going from the top of the site down, going for a swim in the ocean, and then gradually coming up for breakfast to the first chunk of house. And then midday, there'd be a midday house, and then evening, there'd be an evening house. And essentially, we wound up with these 7 kind of chunks. But I think what was very interesting for us is that he had this very kind of determined idea about moving across the site, or moving down through the site. So we were very interested in this issue of paths. And then actually also trying to almost treat the whole site as his house, which is when I was talking about the 2.2 hectares, that's why I thought it is for us quite an important notion. So that the house is no longer an object, the house is the landscape, or vice versa. And so these are very early studies where we became sort of interested in trying to find this relationship between paths, the land, an interior program which would somehow be both half in the site and half out of the site. Where the site itself, it became kind of ambiguous as to where the actual site ended and the house began. Here there's some kind of crude beginnings of those elements. Here again, and these are kind of conceptual diagrams. This is just to say that this is the part where one entered, parked a garage inside the mountain here, but essentially left the cars here, and then walked in, and then at some point there's a hole in the mountain in the boot, and you walk through the boot and come out inside the house. These are different pieces. This is a kind of tennis court thing. This is where he wanted a space for a sort of Zen meditation. This is the breakfast. This is the lunch. This is the major house element itself. And then some of these became a bit more developed later on. So as we're moving round, essentially what we became very interested in was trying to take the topographic lines, developing those into a matrice, or a matrix that would run right across the whole site, and then from that matrix actually develop a new synthetic skin that would become the roof as well as the walls in some places, as well as actually extruded down both the walls and the floor of the interiors. What's very interesting with that is that all of a sudden with these drops across the site, we were also finding that we could both leave the matrix to determine actually also views out onto different aspects of the landscape as well as the ocean. So in a strange kind of way, there's a kind of synthetic naturalism that happens with the house. This is just a kind of almost a caricature of a path abruptly kind of piercing one of these things. And as we develop how to get the path or the insides of that becoming a kind of path, or these becoming, in a sense, ways of circulation, but also programmatic layers, topographic layers underneath the roof, giving an idea of scale. Okay. Now, at this point, we concentrated on one which was called the Maison Lunch. And this is a piece which We've exposed in the last Biennale as well as in a number of places around the world. We have not got anywhere close to building the house. The client says someday, but I think it's kind of a dream. But but funnily enough, it's been kind of an extraordinary project because we've, in a way, kept on developing it in the office, and I kind of like the aspect of that. The roof, then we start to open here, and this became a very important moment because we said, well, why couldn't we actually open not only windows but also the roof up? Now, the important thing is to say, and I left that out at the beginning, is that this part of the Corsica gets extremely hot and extremely cold. But in summertime, there's a whole issue about placing your body across, not across the landscape, but in different parts of the house in order to always be close to movement of air, a cooling air. And so what we did was we essentially said, well, why can't the roof actually be something which is both operated meteorologically and also operated by the movement of someone inside the house. So we have a whole series of tropic movements, which are both related to, in a sense, the biorhythms, but also the functional necessities, of course. And this is where we were heading. Essentially, where we stopped the project at this point with the client. These are earlier studies. This is the more recent one, as I said. So you've got this kind of this opening matrice that starts opening and closing and directing different interests. Whether it's entering the house or letting wind or light into the different rooms or the different circulation spaces. Now, is it possible that you could just help me on that? Because I just wanted to show a very short film, and I'm not too sure because I didn't quite understand how you're. Yep, that's great. Okay, super. So this is the, thank you, this is the site that's modelled, or in a sense it's, as I said, for us it's very much the house. The whole thing is, we consider a house. This is the top part of the site. This is the part that you come in on, this road piece, and then this is the path that comes in off that and then dives under the mountain here. You've got to imagine a certain amount of this with bush, but then on the other side of this, it's quite barren. There's sort of bush in the foreground, and then we're coming up to a kind of a rather barren part here. But you can start to see, in a sense, how we imagine these different elements operating. This is a courtyard, so it's an open space underneath the top of the mountain. In the background here is the tennis courts. Here are a series of there's living rooms. This is going to the maison lunch. This is what he was trying to, and we didn't really define it too much, but it was the idea it was a music space, a music pavilion. So we're coming around the maison lunch now, which was the element I was telling you about. This is the Zen pavilion at the top of the site. Now, the important thing for us also was, in fact, what was the stuff, in a way, of the site, and actually what would be the material eventually for this. And we started looking at we were imagining a kind of synthetic material that looked like vegetal material. And we became extremely interested in the idea that is it not possible to make something that was synthetic but growing. And at some point we were trying to look into this, but we didn't get absolutely any further. And if I can just go back to the main from that. We didn't really get any further at that point, and we didn't stop the thing. Of course, it's this ongoing. It's still an ongoing kind of interest as to how we do that. And then we come back into this one. Okay, and then you've got to jump because we need to come back. Sorry, can we come back to the, because we're going back to the beginning. So it would be coming down to go down. Yep. And then it would be starting here if we can. And then, okay, and then we click it one more time. So if we go back. Actually, it would be that if you can click on that. This one, this is the first one. Yep. So you can't go back? Mm-hmm. Or just go straight to that, but you can't do it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sorry about that. We just need to go run quickly through the, so that we can just come back to where we were. So the next project that I want to talk about after the Maison course is a project that we're essentially building in about 2 months in Paris, and it's a housing project for 100 apartments, and it's called the Herald. Okay, great, super. You just had it, and we can, okay, fantastic. Okay, thanks a lot. Sorry about that. Anyway, the housing, I'll try and move rapidly, quickly now. It's just the housing is on a site, which was an old hospital. Essentially, the hospital was destroyed. It was a very polluted piece of landscape. We had actually 7 problems really to deal with, and to give an idea of the problems, some of them were to do with very ancient trees, which we were asked to leave. That was one kind of problem. We were also asked to respect an idea which I guess also you have in Britain, but I'm not too sure, where in fact you need to leave a certain amount of the site, which is unbuilt as a piece of land. So you cannot drill down, you can't go down into it. And then we had other problems to do with sight lines across the site, which had to do respect the problems of seeing from one side of the site across. So we had to essentially work with these. We had also a setback, a vertical setback, which had to work in a kind of what they call a Haussmannian gabarit, or a kind of setback of a building as it goes up in Paris. It moves back and gives you the silhouette, very much a kind of a cliche silhouette of Paris, as you all know, of the roof as it moves back on a curve. That really sits within a thing called a gabarit, or a setback. So these kinds of setbacks, of course, they imposed on us for the project. Essentially, what we did was we got to the point where we realized we actually couldn't build the number of housing that they wanted on the project, and what we wanted to do was essentially take then those problems, the setback problems, and actually build the trees or the land, build right to the limits of that. And what happens is that by doing that, we introduced a grid, or a gigantic matrice again, into the city of Paris, and actually, in this case, strangely took the method that we had been using for the development of the Florence Lowy project and applied it in a kind of like gigantic urban scale. And so these, in a sense, become the volumes which are related somehow to those setback problems. The resulting cutouts or decored elements from this gigantic matrix that you can sort of only imagine gives us these kind of resultant pieces. The ground floor, in terms of its program, is quite interesting. It's a very kind of careful work between the logement and the exterior. It's for heavily, very, very handicapped people. And then all of the rest is social housing. It's the first project in Paris to be built under a guideline which is called the HQE, the High Quality Environmental. And these are rules which are about, obviously I think we have them in Britain, and they've probably been in Germany for about 30 years. But France, in terms of its environmental issues, is extremely slow to move. But recently they've introduced this kind of legislation where you have to actually come up with all of the the environmental rules, the classic ones. If you build this out of concrete, what's the concrete? If you break it, is it reusable? What kind of energy goes into producing the different materials in the project? Can they be proved to be environmentally friendly, et cetera, et cetera. So it goes on down the list. But what we did was we managed to, in a way, create a building from these lists of also constraints and very severe constraints. And they're interesting logements or interesting apartments. They're traversant in French, meaning that they have light in both senses of the plan, and so in a sense you have these balconies in the back, which are not balconies really, I should say. They're coursive walkways with a lift and a staircase. They're essentially open to the outside. And what we did was we managed to actually then create an envelope. The exterior balcony is a green balcony on which we have a rock surface, and it's a volcanic rock surface, which we then we seed the rock surface and are able to actually grow a landscape out of the volcanic rock of the balcony. So it's quite interesting because at the same time you can walk on it, but it will be a very kind of tough seeded kind of surface. The surface really that's seeded is more towards the edge of the balcony. That was kind of one way of introducing a kind of a landscape onto the balcony. They're also solar powered, drip feeding, so that the things are fed on a communal solar power system for each building. And then the interesting thing really is that, I think the layer here is a very banal layer. It's just a series of glass panels, in some ways banal, but then there's a layer between the two, which is actually a sliding essentially like a shower curtain. And that's an interesting plastic that we were also able to prove that it was environmentally friendly. And it is essentially, it gives the people in each apartment the idea of creating a thing called a jardin d'hiver, or winter garden. And they close up with a very kind of simple shower curtain, which is floor to ceiling in this case. They close this up, and of course they can grow plants. They can use this as a layer inside winter, which traps warmed air by the sun, and then that can actually again be used. These doors, these secondary doors, then the apartment can be opened up completely. So there's quite an interesting issue to do with thermal layering and air movement within the building. This gives you an idea of, in a way, those balconies. What was interesting is that we were able to offset the extraordinary rigor of the plan, being a very orthogonal thing, with then obviously the costing of doing something like this balances it out, because this is of course where one starts to invest the money in terms of the costs, if we're going to talk about that. This gives you an idea of the layering. Here we have the matrice. Here we have the layers, these plastic screens that are openable or closable by each tenant within the building. Then what they call the noyau of logement, which has to do with also the way in which heat and air and fluids are kept within the core center of the building, and that being also related to the arguments which are environmental, etc. And then this is another view from the back side of the site. Another project that I wanted to show was a project which we finished in January this year, which is the Communication Center for Renault. What's interesting with the site is that there is a very unusual island here called Ile Séguin, and it is the island of which Ando was going to be building his museum, but that's essentially changed now in Paris. And he is no longer going to build a big museum on this site. But this area, which is called a trapeze, as well as the island, was the gigantic center for Renault car production. And in the 1980s, they decentralized, and all of this became, vacant land. And essentially one of the only projects that they kept and they didn't destroy was a building that was built in the 1980s by a French architect called Claude Visconti. And it's an interesting building because it has a sawtoothed roof, which is quite unique in the sense that it starts very low, middle height, and then very high towards this end. And it was, in a sense, the tool shop for Renault, and with offices in this end of the site. This is the building how we found it when we did the competition, essentially an empty skeleton, a very beautiful empty skeleton, and looking towards the lower areas, sort of at middle height areas. Just to give you an idea, this is 9 meters just to the underside of that, and then up in here we're a 12-meter high space. So it's a kind of gigantic space, and the problem here was actually how to introduce a huge exhibition space for Renault car company, because they wanted to, in a way, keep their their hand to be a presence still within Paris, not to cede all their territory, but to actually create a world, what they call the World Communication Center. So we won the competition to insert, and really it's another intervention project, insert a new architecture within an existing architecture. Again, in this case, the most remarkable thing was, of course, the shed roof. I shouldn't say again, I should say Pompidou, the interesting thing to do was the grid. In this case, we thought really the issue of repetition to do with the shed roof was one of the most interesting. Plus, we had a big problem. In this case, we could use the floor for an exhibition, but we could actually, really the constraint was to not touch the floor, or touch the floor at least as possible. So in a sense, I also talk about it as kind of the inverted Pompidou in that sense. Although the language is a different language, and it really is a language which then starts to come from this shed roof, which is about extruding down the imprint or the memory of this shed roof. Here are a series of diagrams really related to different issues of flux. Essentially what we proposed in the end was finally to give them around a central core area, which is a gigantic exhibition area, and then a work area, work offices for about 150 people here. The whole site has about 400 people working every day on it. And they have in the south a series of rooms which they called in the end, which was very nice because we started calling it that, and I never thought it would take on, but for them, they're simply called their brainstorming rooms. And there's a theatre of 500 people, 300 people, 100 people. These are the walls, which are really the principal idea was to actually start to extrude, as I said, down from this field of geometry. And actually create two kinds of things. One is that the field creates a series of walls in an east-west sense, and then in a north-south sense was to somehow, in some cases, use the wall as a projection, as a screen wall, or as a projection for an image, or an exhibition element. Or in other cases, between two walls or more walls create a volume, an interior volume. So we have in a north-south sense a whole series of secondary walls which are set back. The white walls are, interestingly enough, I'll get to it when I get to the images, but the white walls are fabricated by a company that makes aeroplane wings as well as nose pieces in Toulouse. for the Toulouse industry, and has also been working with the Airbus on the latest 380, the biggest plane. And what they made for us here was all of the white walls are in honeycomb, which is, of course, it's the aluminium, the sheets of aluminium with a honeycomb structure in the middle, which makes the honeycomb is extremely light, and of course very, very interesting for us because we wanted to float or hold above the ground as much as possible. This project. These are the offices I talked about, and in the southern side, a whole series of rooms. These are, in French we call them a cimez, or we did for this project. And the cimez is interesting because it's an ambiguous thing. It has the role of being like an exhibition wall for art, in a traditional sense of a kind of beaux-arts. And it is also a wall of sorts. It has a sort of functional reason as well. For us, we kind of play between the two, because it really isn't something so much to attach art, but really to project art off or on, I should say, or imagery to do with the exhibition space. So we enter from here, big exhibition space, 6,500 meters squared, a series of amphitheaters. And if we keep on moving around, we have a series of, what's interesting is that you come in major circulation in the south, and then actually coming in through these kind of secondary streets. It's an extremely urban project inside, and coming into these secondary streets, then you come into a series of light wells. So if we keep on going all around, this is the mezzanine level. On the mezzanine level, you have these cimez facing into the mezzanine level, at which point you can circumnavigate the space. This is a section through part of the building, the long section, a cross section with the cimez walls. The building itself, all of this has been demolished more recently. This is where the Ando project was going to be. Foster has just won a big project just in front of us, just here. And these are the offices. So everything in a sense is like in a sense they're both extruded down, but they're also box-like somehow, the wooden volumes themselves. So you can see this interest of getting the light in. This is a nighttime view, of course, you don't really see that. These are the cimez, and it gives you an idea of the height. There's huge doors at this end of the space with a walkway which moves up hydraulically, and we can get a bus as big as a bus into the space. The idea is that they will do about eventually like 3 exhibitions a year, based on the, of course, the all to do with the motor car. But Renault, not unlike in a sense Peugeot or any of the other companies, in the 90s has moved into this very much this interest of kind of making a parallel discussion between itself, architecture, art, culture, and not just a parallel, but somehow mixing all of that. I think this space is about trying to do that. So there's a strategy, there's an internal strategy behind Renault, which is behind the space also, to create the space as a cultural space for the car. And that's also why there's a parallel reason for the white walls. That was to also reflect light coming down and bouncing it around inside the space, but also actually to try and make this parallel relationship between, it's not a museum, but it's a space for exhibiting and in a way presenting the car as a kind of a cultural object. So there's that kind of strategy going on behind the client's interests. This is looking down the space. Again, these walls are the aluminium walls I'm talking about with the Nida Bay, the honeycomb structure on the inside. The roof, of course, existed. All the structure is painted the same color as the existing. We cleaned it and then repainted it exactly the same as the existing building. So this is the clean, the air conditioning that we bring in. We very much, again, wanted to make it very clear where our project began and where it stopped, and where the earlier architect's project was. So it's very much trying to do a similar thing to Pompidou, which is about dialoguing, but then deforming somehow that system and creating something new inside it. These are the wood walls that I was talking about that are in a north-south sense, looking down from the mezzanine into this exhibition space. You can imagine it filled with different exhibitions in the future. So these are kind of empty images in a sense. So the walls that hang off and hang from the roof and also hang off the steel structure. Again, there's these walkways that come around, up, down, up, down. We have like 8 staircases that jump around. So they give, in a sense, the viewer, the spectator, multiple views, both from above and below, of exhibitions that are going on. So it's an extremely active space. And yet at the same time, it's a very, very large space. So it's got this kind of curious double nature to it. This is looking into one of the theatres. We drive, this is big enough that we open the doors and we drive in here, and then each theatre has a rotating turntable on which the car is presented. I like this theatre probably the most because it's for 100 people, so it's extremely intimate, and it's very steep, so it's a bit like a kind of a 19th century sort of surgical, London school of, which I've never been to, but I sort of imagine in 19th century engravings of students looking down and watching a kind of cadaver or something. In this case, it's the car, and it's also an interesting theatre because it has a double way of operating. It operates as a staircase and also an informal way of entering a theatre, normally through here, etc. This is inside the theatre. This is the rotating plate. The car in this case is definitely the centre of the défilé. It's the centre of the action, and is very much the object of desire. One of the brainstorming rooms, again with natural and the plated bent walls behind it, so you're always aware of being inside or outside of something. The office spaces, the office is extremely simple, but what is quite nice is that we were able to get light, natural light as well as incandescent into it. So I think they're very pleasant working spaces to be inside this kind of box-like thing. Again, back into the main space. Moving through a series of anecdotal images around that space. But these are gigantic volumes that become 9 and then higher once inside, and then 12 and then 16 meters even higher. And they have a series of programs. There's a whole series of kitchens. The client has this kind of fetish about eating, drinking, and watching, looking at cars. And that's very much a kind of essential cultural thing of Renault. So we have a series of kitchens within these kind of volumes. So there's something always about sort of using these interior spaces, of course, for the presentation of food as well as they're great meeting places. The whole south part can be closed off. We have sliding doors. You can see a rail here very finely. It's a fine point to make, but just to say that the whole south part can be closed off, and it is sometimes rented out by Renault to the public. So there's a double functioning. There's a lot of cross programming going on on the project. Very complicated and quite interesting how it operates. You have Nissan Renault today, of course. So the Japanese part of Renault is essentially now this has become really the key point to come when in Paris for both companies to meet and share new ideas. It's very much a space where they're launching ideas too, launching prototypes. So the conferences will be about that, discussing brainstorming rooms. I should say that a big part of those offices is essentially one part of Renault, which is the communication. And these are the guys that are looking 2 or 3 years down the line into the future and saying this is the way in which this is the direction that the public are going to be moving. And that's kind of a fascinating, that was a very, very interesting thing to be involved in, working with these people. So those are the people that are essentially brainstorming, just to describe what, in a sense, is behind the brainstorming rooms. We're not involved in the exhibition, but just to give you an idea of an exhibition inside the space. Look, we're not that happy with the exhibition currently there right now, but that's in a way part of the the thing of actually having in a way created. The project was very much about creating in a way a background and a kind of frame in which then the car is the center of the stage. And in that sense, it's a quite sort of dichotomous project in relationship to Pompidou, which is in a way, ironically, the other way around. The last project that I wanted to show you this evening is a project that we won this year, I think your time now. And it's an important project for Paris. It's called the Cité de la Mode et de la Design. If you know Paris, simply put, here is the BNF, the National Library by Perrault, Dominique Perrault. Here is Gare Austerlitz is here. Of course, Bercy, the Garden des Plantes, and of course the great River Seine with its series of bridges. Our site is actually in this kind of nodule. It's a kind of strange. Sorry, I'm off a bit. Is here, and I'll show you it as we zoom in. But we're in an interesting part of Paris. All of this part, in a sense, is still in the process of being developed by architects. Of course, I think there's an urban plan which is fairly hideous to some degree and quite dry all around the Bibliothèque, or Grande Bibliothèque. That's a kind of another problem. There's interesting, very, very interesting kind of part of the city, fairly run-down part of the city here. The trains, of course, that acted as this kind of dissecting element over the years, and left, of course, these kinds of areas before you go out to Ivry, which are very, very interesting areas, which are now in the process of being transformed into a huge university of 25,000 students in the future. There's nothing there today. They're industrial buildings, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this movement, Bercy, of course, a number of years ago, with the gardens, but there's this movement gradually, as Paris expands, gradually the centre moving out. In this case, it's moving east. And this project is very much a part of that movement. The idea that the edge of the Seine in the future is going to be developed more and more as a place for bicycles, people moving, etc., like it is today as a heart. But also the river will give way eventually, and the plans are quite interesting and quite strong, to being an active river for transportation, as Paris is closed off really to the motor car. So the public will be using the river in the future a lot more. So this kind of idea of a new Venice or a new transportation mode of transportation in the heart of the city is a very interesting one. And our project is related to that. So if I keep on moving, these are kind of simplistic diagrams. I didn't really want to include them, but this is from a study for the client. But we have our site here, which is called the Docks of Paris, an old building, the first concrete building in France to be built at the turn of the century. It really predates any related work by Auguste Perrault. And it's a very interesting piece, extremely simple. They decided that they actually were going to demolish it about 10 years ago, and then there was this kind of ongoing fight what to do with it. Essentially, the proposition that we were given was whether we wanted actually to keep it or propose to demolish it. And I think it was obviously kind of an interesting project. So of course, in our minds, we decided to keep it because we wanted to do something with it. Most people did keep it anyway because it is an interesting project. The problems are anyway. Let me move on to the problems are quite interesting. Here in the back, you have a thing called the rapid transport, which is actually a fast freeway under the building in the back that used to actually be a train line. Now, this building is interesting because in the history, barges like this one here pulled up alongside. And then there were gantries on top of like this, but a smaller version, and a series of them on top of the roof would then bring the goods from the barge up and then bring them into either this level or this level of this huge, gigantic stockroom. And then horse and dray would come in, because we were sort of turn of the century, would come in the back from the street and take away the stuff, or a train underneath would also take some of the goods anyway through here. What was interesting was that today it's extremely rundown project. It is like that today, and our proposition is the following. It was an international competition. We were again, I guess the British group that was the most known would be Future Systems. We won with a project which essentially the problem given to us was that we had to cut the building here, creating a huge courtyard, an opening. So that was kind of part of the urban rules. And then essentially what we decided was to propose something for the continuity of the edge of the Seine. So make a large urban project that would then also actually start to dialogue both with the building, the grid of the building, and then the new project. This is a plan mass looking down on top of the roof. What we decided here was to take actually the structure. Now the structure is very interesting because in that sense, you go A, B, and then A. Those things break down into like a 7.5 and then a 10 meter increment all the way along. What we took then from that was a 2.5 increment and created, in a sense, a new project, which both, in a sense, is a kind of phantomatic image of that structure, which is then overlaid over the top. And what we created was something which we call the plug over. And the plug over essentially is a creature that is both able to bring people up on the sides of the building. So we build out over the water of the Seine, which we could. We had a gabarret, or a building limit to build out into, and then we could only build up one floor above the existing building. So we essentially, all of our new project is on the outside of the existing building. All, in a sense, the move. The rest of the interior is extremely simple and left as simple as possible. But the famous plug over is something which comes down, drapes down over the side of the Seine, across the roof, and then drops on the other side. On the roadside. It's a glass, gigantic glass volume on the riverside, a roof which is deformed with a series of functions inside, and then glass on the other side. The idea here was that also we wanted to create as much transparency as possible between both river and water. So essentially these kind of tubes that move up and down, or kind of create an alternative ways of moving from this level up to this level. Here at this level, I should just quickly explain to you the program because it is important to describe the architecture. Here at this level is a gigantic exhibition area of like 3,500 meters squared, which is orientated, will be in the future, towards design and fashion. Here in this part we have a fashion school, really Paris's most interesting institute of Français de la Mode, and they will be across 3 floors here. So we'll have students constantly on the site, as well as working, as well as exhibiting their work. What we have here is a rather large restaurant at that end of the building. The students at this end of the building. There's a big open kind of plaza on top of the building. And then on the lower side, running right across here, we have a series of cafes. We have a music producer called Naive, which is very interesting. Essentially, he was the guy that started Virgin, although he's not credited with it, and as a concept, and a series of other people, editors. Anyway, it's an interesting crowd, a really great crowd. And so what's interesting for Paris is it's really the first time we're able to bring both design and fashion together. They've been completely separate things. For a long time, both worlds have been fascinated in how to bring about that combination. And certainly they've been working at it, but they've never really had the opportunity on a site. And thank God, in this particular case, we had a client. I should say everyone on the competition had. It was a very interesting competition because you had, as an architect, not just to design it, but you had to design the program yourself. So you had to come up with the you had to come up with the people that would be filling the building in the future. And then you had to essentially get a letter from all of them stating that they were interested in developing the project, etc. So our project that we developed with our developer in this case was orientated towards fashion and design. And so that was a very, very interesting experience because we're not just working as designers anymore, we're working as programmers, and we're programming our own architecture. And at that point it's very interesting because all of a sudden you find this potentially fantastic liberty. It's not so extraordinary because of course there's other defaults with the idea, but it's a very interesting one, and it's one where, in this case, we were able to actually interview these people, talk to them, try and bring them in at into the process at the very beginning, and actually be part of that idea of fusioning both the fashion world and the design world. So that's a truly kind of remarkable thing, I think, about the project in terms of the programming. These are just kind of straightforward, the existing structure, the skin, the combinations, the different problems, circulations, both longitudinally, the different programming needs, the different levels. These are images, of course, at the competition level. We're now in a much more advanced stage, but it's the big project in the office right now. Essentially, these smaller programs on the lower level, etc., moving up and then up onto the roof. The plug over being, of course, the green element, which is a kind of both a landscape on the roof, and you saw in the axonometric image. So it'll be a growing roof, as well as a series of kind of green glasses, we're hoping, which we're working with. The idea of the green also is a very interesting thing, because of course it will be breaking down the heat intake. The glass over the Seine is actually, the walkway over the Seine is an open walkway, so there's no problems. We resolve the problem of part of the problem of the heat loading here is resolved, because actually our real facade is there, and at the same time we protect people from wind and rain, but at the same time we're an extraordinary volume, but done in a very simple single glass. I'm getting very technical this evening, I don't know why anyway. But, and then this is of course another cut. We have here a floating pontoon, which we're hoping we'll still keep in the project, which essentially the idea of in summertime is that this is like a series of kiosks, because the Seine is actually a flooding, the flooding level is about here. So every number of years, supposedly, we will be under flood, which is an interesting experience. So we essentially, anyway, we've done all of these kind of calculations. But what it leads to is all of this is a very éphémère architecture. We cannot make anything permanent, and there's a whole thing about how the water washes right through the space. You cannot have walls. Anyway, these are the different elevations. As I said, they're essentially glass. Looking, these are very kind of simple perspectives, looking from the big public space across. In front of the building, we'll have two things: a water taxi pulling up, as well as a bateau mouche pulling up. And this will be a kind of bateau bus which goes up and down the Seine, which has already started, but will be much more important in the future. And will be one of the stops will be here in front of the building. So we should have quite an interesting movement of people coming to the site. So it has this kind of strange, certainly will have the strange issue of tourism, as well as we hope it being a very local kind of scape for people within the city of Paris, a place where they can come to for exhibitions, for different buying music discs, book editions, hanging out at cafes, restaurants. Anyway, that's the general push of the project. And as you can see, the context is a curious one, because it's very much a kind of Paris of the 1970s and then 80s, etc. So it's interesting. It's not the historical Paris is kind of just down there, so we'll be able to faintly see it. But I think for us that's an interesting thing to be involved in anyway. Is the fact that we're involved now in a project which is kind of moving outside of the old centre of Paris. So essentially that's it.
We're running a little late,
Yeah.
but we've got time for a couple of questions if anybody would like to ask Brendan anything.
I wonder, most of your projects are about interventions in existing buildings, and most of them are done through a mesh that actually you deform after with a certain scheme. What is your approach when you do an intervention? I mean, it's all interchangeable to how you several times you say about respecting the time, but what would be your approach to time? How you see your own buildings after being moved?
After being moved.
After being removed, reused.
Well, that's an interesting one. I have no idea. I mean, I really have no. In fact, I think the only thing we said years ago about that was that actually it would be really fascinating that someone else then would come in and build like a third version. There isn't a project that I showed here tonight, but it was for another theatre in Normandy, and that we had as I don't know if it's going to happen, but it could actually happen with another architect coming in and actually doing another kind of intervention. And I think it'd be wonderful. I mean, actually, that would be a really interesting thing for us. We're very much seeing ourselves as a kind of just a part of a thing in time. We don't see it as a kind of. I mean, what can you say? Obviously, you know, part of your ego would like to say that, you know, my God, I wish George would be there in 30, 40, 50 years. And I know that in a way with the restaurant, that's a kind of very touchy, not a touchy, but it's kind of a delicate subject, because we very consciously try to create something which will be there in 20, 30, 40 years in terms of its, in terms of just everything, how it's all sort of done. And crudely put, but in a way, I think it has that quality of something which will move quite healthily over time. I mean, today it's 5 years later, and it's still extremely active as a space, and it has an incredible life of its own as a project. And I think part of that was very much trying to create a vocabulary, creating the way in which the vocabulary is made was very much trying to be, was very conscious of actually lasting and trying to make it last. Although the irony, of course, is that it's, in a sense, it's a light intervention. You know, you could actually literally just take all of those things out and you would be left with the space. And I think what was interesting for us was to create something like that. I know that when we talked with Renzo Piano about it, we never talked about it at all until the night, just before the opening night. And we met him for the first time, which was incredible, because Pompidou wanted to keep us all apart. And maybe it was a good thing. I think it was a very good thing. And just because they wanted us, and we also appreciated just doing something, creating something. And he actually said to us, he said, "What's extraordinary is that this is kind of the kind of intervention that I always wanted in Pompidou, but it never happened." And I mean, you can easily talk about the interventions of the people like Gaolenti, etc., over time, which were very much about trying to create monuments, or creating not monuments, but something with permanence. In a system which is actually not permanent. The ideal of Pompidou is that these things are slid in and slid out. The concept is about an étagère, which is like the bookshop. You know, it's a shelf, and so I think the project has that reading. It's a very light project. I think the irony, I mean, touch wood, because we also would like it to last. So, you know, there's a kind of there's a double interest there, of course.
I have one.
Okay.
Very briefly.
Yeah.
I'm hugely impressed by the rigour with which you realise these complex forms.
Mm.
And I would just like to ask quite simply the status of your design process with respect to digital working.
Yep.
Because clearly a huge degree of control and precision is required at the machining end of things.
Right.
And you showed some quite evocative hand drawings early on. And
Right.
I'd really just like to hear a little bit about the way in which these two processes might inform each other.
I think the thing is that, what can I say about all of that? They do. I think it's very interesting, all of this, because in fact I sort of strongly believe anyway that there is an aspect to your brain which actually comes out when you're drawing something by hand, which doesn't necessarily come out through the digital stuff. And yet the digital stuff has this ability also, you know, in working with it, of course, you will discover ways in which you wouldn't have been working through the hand. And so in a very simple way, I really firmly believe that it's actually both, I think it's all part of the same thing, actually, at some point. And I think we sort of, somehow we're getting to that point anyway, in believing that, actually. Maybe in educational circles, certainly I think in creating with the digital media, I think we're getting there. And so I think that's to me, that's a kind of almost a more realistic approach. Just because the stuff that comes out in modelling, maybe even real models, through drawing, hand drawings, there's a gestural thing at times, which is interesting, which doesn't necessarily come out through exploring digital explorations. And I think somehow it's and that doesn't happen on all projects. In some cases, we've literally just been working purely digitally, I should say. But in some cases, we've been jumping backwards and forwards between all of these media, because they all explain certain aspects of a thing, and you do have intentions as a creator. We're not devoid of our own personalities and our own egos and our own creative soul, if you want to put it bluntly. And I think that's an extraordinary thing to sort of almost rediscover, and you do in a way rediscover it with working with digital media. So there's a really interesting mix between all of those things, which I think is essential.
Do you believe that your architecture will be different without media?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, for sure. I don't know how it would be, but I do think so. Yes, I think because and this is a long, lengthy discussion about a series of points, but. Yes, I think so. I think what's maybe interesting with George is that there was definitely a big intention to kind of deform the floor. And in a sense, it's true that could have happened before the digital media came along, the intention behind that. The way in which it was accomplished was only possible physically, materially, technically with digital media. We would never have been able to build it otherwise. Absolutely not. In a conceptual sense, though, I think there's other projects which have actually benefited from our explorations using digital media. I think, for example, one was the Lowy project, where in fact we were working with this idea of a kind of it was a kind of meshscape of sorts, which appeared in Pompidou, but actually it appeared also as a kind of a language, as a very neutral, repetitive language, which we became extremely interested in. And that, I'm certain, came through the digital media. I mean, it's one example. There's others. I think, for example, Corsica too, I think there's aspects of that which would never have appeared otherwise. I'm sure we would have done it differently.
Okay, well, once again, thanks very much.
Okay, all right. Thank you.